GA Museum remembers Bloody Sunday. Welcome to the second in our series of Monday at the Museum playbacks. This recording is of Dr. Anne Dolan's lecture titled Killing and Bloody Sunday Morning, which was recorded live on Microsoft Teams. Enjoy this fascinating lecture.
I'd like to begin really, I suppose, at 9 o'clock on Bloody Sunday morning. At more than a dozen addresses in Dublin, doors were opened by arrangement or by force at 9 o'clock that morning. Within minutes, 19 men had been shot, 5 of them wounded, 14 dead, but it did not stop there. Reprisals followed in Croke Park, as you know, in the afternoon, where Crown forces fired on a crowd of supporters, killing 14 and injuring many, many more. That night or early morning, 3 prisoners were also killed. Of that 3, Dick McKee and Pather Clancy were both heavily involved in the planning of the morning's killings, but Conor Clune, visiting Dublin from County Clare, was believed to be a man in the wrong place, found and arrested very much at the wrong time. Shot while trying to escape from Dublin Castle was the explanation given for these 3 men's fates. But there were more. That night in Dublin Castle, an auxiliary cadet, Henry Spellins, shot himself in the head. Witnesses testified to Spellins' deep depressions, as one put it, since the Great War, but blamed, as they said at the inquest, the happenings of the morning which he had been discussing, and that they had preyed on his mind. On the 9th of December 1920, Colonel Hugh Ferguson Montgomery, one of the men shot in Upper Pembroke Street, died from the wounds he had received 18 days before. But that morning the IRA had meant to kill more. Other houses and hotels were visited that day. The lucky ones escaped or had changed addresses. Others had just gone out. Some had not returned from wherever they had been the night before. Yet even this was all a mere shadow of more ambitious intentions. For months, names were added and subtracted from a list of what became known as the particular ones, Michael Collins's own phrase for the members of a new British spy ring rumoured to have come to Dublin, to grasp, as Lloyd George had instructed, the Irish murder gang, as he called them, by the throat. Snatches of information from maids and porters and wastepaper baskets, times of comings and goings, places with lights on after curfew, all manner of whispers and overhearings turned themselves into dossiers and reports. The simplest things were noted: who wore a signet ring on one of his left fingers, who wore a grey or a black or a navy suit, which one had a girlfriend in a flat above a billiard hall, which one might talk if he got a little drunk. There were suspicions and confirmations, a face associated with the killing of John Lynch in his hotel bedroom some time before, another source prepared to swear that another of them had tortured Kevin Barry. There were rumours about a Cairo gang, talk of secret missions in the Great War, stories of dastardly achievements in foreign fields, of British spies coming closer, ever closer, all the time becoming a case of them or us. This may all sound a little too familiar, at least after reading many of the Bureau of Military History statements taken in the 1940s and 50s, or Ernie O'Malley's interviews with IRA men involved that day. And this account and this type of, if you like, rendition of the day, or the morning in particular, certainly seems very familiar if you read those sources. The dull refrain that this killing in the morning needed to be done, that they had to be stopped, that they were all spies, that there were no mistakes made, comes again and again with dreary repetition. Most is said about why it was done, about the rightness of it being done, about the care and attention that went into proving every case against each man, of proving each one to be what their brutal killings in a way necessitated them to be, intelligence officers and spies. They were the murder gang, Liam Tobin said to Ernie O'Malley years later. They were capable, he said, of murder, certainly, and there was a story that some had seen foreign service. To others, the dead were described, as one put it, as the cream of British military intelligence, spies disguised as civilians, as another put it, liable to the death penalty. For many, they must have been guilty, because they supposed, as one memoir of the time put it, that the proof had to be a full 100% watertight before any action could be taken by the IRA, and the IRA could count on a degree of trust. As another interview recorded, they were good men and they wouldn't kill any innocent people. The killings may have been dreadful, horrible, but the same person who used those words to describe them was sure at the same time that I have no doubt they deserved it. Enough people believed there was no smoke without fire, but this retreat again and again in these sources to explanations makes a kind of sense. Although the then young IRA man Todd Andrews revelled in the fact, as he said, that the British press at the time sucked Roget's thesaurus dry to find words to denounce us, we were gunmen, terrorists, extremists, murderers, assassins, butchers, thugs. Such bravado possibly came more easily to Andrews when writing his memoirs 59 years after the event. Murderer was the word that seemed to rankle most, the only moniker that Collins was said to resent. Lloyd George may have pronounced that the 14 dead, as he said, got what they deserved, beaten by counter-jumpers. Churchill may have even thought them, as he said, careless fellows who ought to have taken precautions. But nevertheless, Collins still penned a remarkable defence of these killings on Bloody Sunday morning, in case the question of that event at the treaty negotiations in London came up. He wrote, "My one intention was the destruction of the undesirables who continued to make miserable the lives of ordinary decent citizens. I have proof enough to assure myself of the atrocities which this gang of spies and informers have committed. Perjury and torture are words too easily known to them. If I had a second motive, it was no more than a feeling such as I would have for a dangerous reptile. By their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. That should be the future's judgment on this particular event. For myself, my conscience is clear. There is no crime in detecting and destroying in wartime the spy and the informer. They have destroyed without trial. I have paid them back in their own coin." He's quoted in this way, albeit to less colourful effects, by General Crozier, by Hayden Talbot, by any who claim to have discussed his methods and motives on Bloody Sunday with him before his death. But it was maybe easier for Collins to talk in terms of dangerous reptiles and sweeter air. He was elsewhere on Bloody Sunday morning. He was not pointing a gun at a man in his bed. Whatever thoughts and images and descriptions of those 14 and later 15 dead men Collins cared to conjure with, the circumstances of the deaths would always somewhat undo much of his careful reflections and justifications. Even many of those who took part that morning knew that there was something different about this type of killing. It was one thing to gun down a man in the street. It was quite another to barge into his home, into his bedroom, to shoot him where he lay, in front of his wife, maybe within hearing of his child. That 9 of the men killed wore only their pyjamas seemed to tip the scales even further still. There was the added indignity of meeting your maker without even being properly dressed. It was for these reasons that Larry Nugent, who was involved that day, was so insistent in his Bureau of Military History statement that it was not murder, that it was, as he said, an act of war duly carried out under orders, that the life of every IRA man in Dublin was at stake. Why Frank Thornton, also involved, kept insisting, even at lectures to young Irish Army cadets in 1940, that, as he put it, that morning was one of the most critical ones in the history of our movement, and as he said, all jobs were executed, even when they were not. The British Secret Service was wiped out on the 21st of November, he said. That was the story, and in ways the nature of the killing, the cost of what followed in the afternoon perhaps meant that most of the men involved were going to stick to it too. And it's very striking in their testimony the way they don't actually connect the morning in any way with the events of the afternoon. And most of the men whose testimony I've looked at in a variety of different sources rarely make any mention to what happens in Croke Park. Most historians, though, who've written about Bloody Sunday since, have stuck to that story, if you like, of Thornton since. Tim Coogan was happy to recount the participants' traditional version of events. He wrote, "The sounds of Dublin's mass bells were suddenly punctuated by staccato bursts of shooting as Collins's men crippled the entire British Secret Service operation in Ireland." James Gleeson's book Bloody Sunday is prefaced with the claim that it was the day most responsible for the existence of the Irish Republic. What interest there was in Bloody Sunday morning seemed preoccupied in proving or disproving whether those killed in the morning were or were not the spies and intelligence officers that they were claimed to be. It seems clear to us now that 6, perhaps 7, of the 15 killed were involved directly in intelligence duties in Dublin. That 2 more were court-martial officers. The 2 were auxiliaries who were called on that morning to go for help when the shooting was heard. Both had joined on the same day from different parts of England because they were flat broke. Another man killed was fleeing the IRA in County Clare. Another, Leonard Wilde, killed in the Gresham Hotel. He remains something of a mystery man to us still. What is clear, though, is that Thomas Smith just rented out rooms in his house and was killed alongside one of his tenants, and that Patrick McCormick was in Dublin buying horses, was, as he has been called, a charming chancer, shot in his bed in the Gresham Hotel, with the Irish Field newspaper still gripped in his hand. Most killed were in their late 20s or early 30s, the youngest 22, the oldest 47. 9 were married, 2 engaged, and 6 of the 15 killed left children behind. That their deaths did not cripple British intelligence in Ireland, as many claimed over the years, has been largely proved by British and Irish records and reports released since, and most, I think, historians would accept that now. In ways, though, that work is done, if you like. What I want to draw out here are the experiences and recollections of the men who went to those different addresses, who did what was asked of them to do, and who grappled with the consequences of their actions, in some cases for the rest of their lives. So in a way, how do they describe those events? And I want to draw really on a lot of their testimony in what follows. The scale of the operation was too large for Collins's intelligence officers and his squad to do it alone. Chosen and reliable men from various battalions of the Dublin Brigade were informed throughout the previous week that something was to happen, but were given little detail. They then had to choose reliable men to join an intelligence agent and a member of the squad who had been assigned to each, as they said, particular job. But most of the men involved, the men sent to do the shooting, knew little or nothing of spies or killing until the night before, when even then the numbers to be shot still fluctuated to an alarming extent. That night before, they were called to secret locations around the city, to Gardiner Street, to Gloucester Street, to Parnell Square. Some were told what was to happen, where it was to take place, and who would go with them to identify the man to be shot. But a little over 12 hours before the shooting, most of the men involved, we might say, still really knew little of what was to be done. They had that night to think about shooting a man they knew only as a name, maybe even an assumed name at that, at a certain address somewhere in the city. Some knew where to meet, where to collect their guns and ammunition, who would wait outside on guard, who would patrol the stairs, who would go with the intelligence officer to do the shooting in the room. Others knew less, just told where to go to be ready, as Matty MacDonald put it, for a job in the morning. We weren't told what we were to do. For most, there was no real time to prepare, no real time, the organisers might argue, for them to worry about right and wrong, about the fear of doing it and getting caught. Harry Colley recalled the proposition being put to the men in Gloucester Street as follows, and he said, "It is well to place on record that Sean Russell, the officer in command, explained to them that the men to be shot were members of a new secret service which the enemy had brought into this country, that many of them had great reputations as secret service men working for England during the recent war, that it was vitally necessary for the success of our fight that they be removed, that no country had scruples about shooting enemy spies in wartime, that if any man had moral scruples about going on this operation, he was at full liberty to withdraw, and no one would think any the worse of him, that he wanted every man to be satisfied in his conscience that he could properly take part in this operation." Of course, Sean Russell's approach makes sense. The luxury of conscience was all very well, but from a commanding officer's point of view, it was likely to ruin the chance of the killing and to get other men captured or killed in the attempt. Jim Slattery had a slightly different recollection of this meeting, of whether he had much choice in the matter of taking part. He remembered the briefing the night before had two young men watching the door, almost, and certainly as he interpreted, as a warning to anyone who considered trying to get out. But then, why should they? Headquarters had told them that they were going to kill spies, and that should have been good enough for them all. It certainly was for Frank Thornton, who operated happily on the basis that if the IRA intelligence chose to kill, then the target must have been guilty. Some of them admitted passing an uneasy night. Frank Soren checked the location one more time. James Carrigan charged and recharged the battery for the car he was meant to drive. Larry Nugent slept in the same bed with Eamon Fleming, both knowing the next day would be important, but neither of them saying more than just a few words to each other throughout the night. Matty MacDonald knew, as he said, that it would be a big job, so he played a game of cards and had a drink. Todd Andrews admits that he went to mass, played football, read a book. Apart from suffering a slight concussion at his match and attending a meeting about the next day, it was like any other given Saturday for this 19-year-old. He slept well, he said. He'd been to confession. He was in a state of grace, like so very many more of them that night, all supposedly made ready for their own deaths, perhaps, but maybe mixed with some sort of guarantee of forgiveness in advance. It was only in the morning that Andrews began to feel uneasy. He was, as he said, unattuned to assassination. He was very excited, he said, by the assignment, but the prospect of killing a man in cold blood was alien to our ideas of how a war should be conducted. The 17-year-old Charles Dalton was equally concerned. Outwardly, he wrote, "We were calm and collected, even jesting with each other. But inwardly, I felt that the others were, as I was, palpitating with anxiety." He described waiting to enter the house as the longest 5 minutes of my life, or whether the shortest, I cannot tell, but they were tense and dreadful. It would be easy to say that Dalton wrote this partly for effect in his published memoir, as by this point he was a veteran of other killings. Alternatively, it could be taken that this was no ordinary shooting, that at least the teenager was not yet fully inured to what was about to be done. Indeed, Matty MacDonald remembered, as he said, that Charlie Dalton couldn't sleep that night after Bloody Sunday. He thought he could hear the gurgling of the officer's blood, and he kept awake all night until we told him a tap was running somewhere. There was still that much of the child in him that could be fooled, maybe wanting to hear the lie, because it was ever so much better than putting up with the truth. As we'll see, the longer-term consequences Dalton bore are clear to us now, since the release of his military service pension application. Dalton had done most to find the information to condemn the men in the house in Pembroke Street. He had courted the maid there, got an IRA man employed as the porter. He watched until he knew that the two men he wanted slept in rooms on the 3rd floor. The rest of the British officers in the house were lives that may or may not have been taken on the day. He met Paddy Flanagan at 9:05 as they had arranged the night before. There were brief introductions to the men Flanagan had brought along, and then, as Dalton explained to Ernie O'Malley, it all began. He said, "I was with Flanagan and two fellows, and we went up the left-hand stairs to the 3rd flight. I knew the one where Dowling and Montgomery were, for the girl had told me. The other doorway was adjacent, and there was a landing. The two lads were in bed in pyjamas, and Paddy Flanagan said for us, and they got up rather startled, and I thought this was the time, and I wanted their papers. They were against the wall when Paddy fired. The fellows fell, and they made a gurgling sound. Said I to Paddy Flanagan, I want to search the bloody room. Get to hell out of this, said Paddy. The other fellows brought their men to the hallway. They had the men in pyjamas and they had their hands up. I was stopped by the 3rd Battalion officers. Who are you, they asked. I'm an intelligence officer, I said, and here were not more than 6 or 7 in the house. They were lined up. They were held up on the staircase to the cellars. I saw one hit the floor and fall down the stairs. Paddy Flanagan said goodbye and went up by Earlsford Terrace." And in a sense, you get a sense of the confusion in that place. The two lads in the pyjamas, as he described them, were Major CMC Dowling and Captain Leonard Price. It was not Montgomery, as Dalton suspected. Paddy Flanagan shot Dowling twice and Price once, and Flanagan was an accurate shot. The bullets to the chest killed them both. Colonel Hugh Ferguson, Montgomery and Captain Keenlyside were lined up downstairs in the hall, as Dalton said. Montgomery gave his name and was shot twice in the body. Keenlyside followed and was shot 4 times in the arms and in the jaw. Montgomery was the one who later died in December. Colonel W.J. Woodcock was shot in the shoulder and the back, but managed to climb up the stairs to his room. Lieutenant Murray was wounded as he came down the stairs. Judging even by Dalton's fervid description, there was panic and obviously confusion in Pembroke Street, especially when British officers seemed to be emerging from every door in the house. I think the house was divided into about 12 flats. And this was not to mention all the pushing past, scratching, struggling, screaming wives. Dalton may have felt pity for the men later when he wrote his book, a pity which even the Dominion's office acknowledged when a call to suppress the book was actually raised in the House of Lords in 1931. But that morning he seemed in too much of a hurry, as he put it, to get the bloody hell out of it, to feel very much else at all. Outside 119 Lower Baggot Street, Matty MacDonald shared a joke with Jack Keating, about the size of the hammer he had brought to force in the door, but the hammer wasn't needed. MacDonald went on, "We knocked at the front door, a maid came along, have a letter from the castle, will you deliver this note to Captain Bagley, a one-legged man?" The maid pointing, and in we went. We tapped at the door, opened it and walked in. There were 3 of us. Bagley was in bed, Lemass, Jimmy and I. I was kind of scared. "Captain Bagley," we asked. "That's my name." "I suppose you know what we came for. We came for you." He was the Judge Advocate General. "I suppose you've come for my guns," he said. One of us, Jimmy Brennan, hid it under the bed, and he reached behind for it. "Slugs and a little more," was our reply. "Get up." He was in pyjamas. Lemass and Jimmy and I fired 2 in the head from the 3 guns. I heard Maid screaming afterwards, but I was told she was all right. On the ground floor was Jack Foley. A fellow came out with a towel in pyjamas for a bath, and Jack struck him up, and he was balls naked. Thinking he was a lodger, but he was another British Army officer, and how we didn't know about him. We hadn't any orders about him. MacDonald then took a camera and whatever papers he could find in the room. An examination of the body found that Captain G.T. Bagley had been shot on the top of the head, through the left eye and twice in the chest. About 12 men were admitted to 92 Lower Baggot Street at the same time. William Stapleton was among the men who asked for Captain W.F. Newbury and made their way to the first floor flat. Stapleton said, "After some hammering on the door, it was opened a little. It was evident that the occupant of the room was very cautious and suspicious because he tried to close the door again, but we jammed our feet in it. We fired some shots through the door and burst our way in. The two rooms were connected by folding doors, and the British agent ran into the front room and endeavoured to barricade the door. But some of our party had broken in the door of the front room and we all went in. He was in his pyjamas, and as he was attempting to escape by the window, he was shot a number of times. One of our party on guard outside fired at him from outside. The man's wife was standing in the corner of the room and was in a terrified and hysterical condition. The operation lasted about 15 minutes. Stapleton's reports said really very little. There was plenty about doors and getting in and getting out, but very few details about what happened in that room. Captain Newbury was shot 7 times, his body, as he said, left hanging from the window, whereas Stapleton said he had tried to escape. His pregnant wife could only cover him with a blanket, and it was quite a number of hours before he was taken in. Vinnie Byrne asked to see Lieutenant Peter Ames and Lieutenant George Bennett at the door of 38 Upper Mount Street. The maid was obliging, pointing out their rooms where both men slept. Byrne sent Tom Ennis with some men to the back room, and he went to the front parlour himself. Byrne recounted it as follows. He said, "As I opened the folding door, the officer who was in bed was in the act of going for his gun under his pillow. Doyle and myself dashed into the room at the same time, ordering him to put up his hands, which he did. Doyle dashed around by the side of the bed and pulled a Colt 45 from beneath the pillow. Right behind us came Frank Soren, and he started collecting papers, etc., which was his job. I remember looking into a drawer and seeing a Sinn Féin tie there, and if I'm not mistaken, photographs of the 1916 leaders. I ordered the British officer to get out of bed. He asked me what was going to happen, and I replied, nothing. I then ordered him to march in front of me. I marched my officer down to the back room where the other officer was. He was standing up in the bed facing the wall. I ordered mine to do likewise. When the two of them were together, I thought to myself, the Lord have mercy on your souls. I then opened fire with my Peter, and they both fell dead." Bennett was found with a small wound at the top and a larger wound at the back of the head, 1 on the front of the chest, 3 in the back, and 2 wounds on the right forearm. Ames had 2 wounds to the right armpit, 1 in the right upper arm, 1 to the front and 1 to the right side of the chest, another wound in the back and 1 at the back of his right leg. The inquest did not specify which were entry or exit wounds. It's all too confusing. Vinnie Byrne seemed to be quite content that morning, which is perhaps why he left he was certainly in a hurry, which is maybe why he left his intelligence officer behind him that day. And why this account is so very much at odds with several other versions of the same events. For example, Frank Soren claimed he did the talking at the front door, not Byrne. Tom Ennis was said to have shot one of the officers, and he possibly did so, as the man still lay beside his wife in bed. It's very, very different accounts of that particular event. Tom Keogh, Jim Slattery, Frank Teeling, Dennis Begley and Andy Monaghan went into 22 Lower Mount Street looking for Lieutenant McMahon. They found the man whose real name was Angus in bed with the man who became the inquest's relatively infamous Mr. C. Mr. C testified at Teeling's court-martial later on as follows. He said, "I was awakened about 9 AM by someone shouting, 'Hands up.' When I opened my eyes, I saw 5 men standing at the end of my bed, covering me with revolvers. One of the men who appeared to be acting as leader gave the order to keep McMahon and myself covered, and he proceeded to search the room. He picked up a civilian coat belonging to McMahon and said, 'Is this your coat, McMahon?' McMahon said no. He then put his hand in the inside pocket, took out a wallet and said, 'You're a damned liar,' and put the wallet in his pocket. He then said, 'Where are your guns, Mac?' McMahon said, 'Look here, we are 2 Roman Catholics, but the guns are in that bag.' The man then walked over to the bag, which was lying in a corner of the room, lifted it onto the table and burst the locks off with his hands and took out 3 revolvers. There was one service Colt, 1 Webley Scott automatic and 1 .32 automatic. He put them in his pockets. I then heard firing, which seemed to come from the street, and I heard a noise as if someone was trying to smash in the front door. A man's voice on the landing then shouted, 'Are you all right there, boys? They're surrounding the house.' The 5 men in the room then turned as if to rush out. They went a little way down the room, then halted, and the man who'd been doing the searching raised his revolver, pointed it at the bed and fired. I saw McMahon raise his arm to cover his face, and at the same time I threw myself out of the bed onto the floor. Practically simultaneously, I heard other shots ring out from the other men in the room, and they all rushed out. McMahon was shot 3 times in the chest and once in the buttock. The officer in the next room barricaded his door. 17 shots failed to penetrate it, and he survived. Outside, some passing auxiliaries had been alerted by the screaming of the maids. Two of their number, temporary cadets Carnes and C.A. Morris, were sent to Beggars Bush Barracks for reinforcements, but they were met by some of the IRA Guard posted around the house, brought to the garden of 16th Northumberland Road and shot. Both were shot through the head, but Carnes was also shot in the chest. The officer who found them testified at their inquests, "I saw wounds in their heads, which must have been fired at close range as their hair and skin was burnt." After a brief exchange of fire in which Teeling was shot, all the rest escaped from Lower Mount Street, but not before Tom Keogh was said to have made a date with one of the maids. How much that was made up after the event is another matter. Dennis Begley's account was a little different from Mr. C's. C was, after all, considered a drunkard and a coward, if not worse, and this comes from some of the British records, suffering, as they said, from shell shock. There was talk also on the same file from the same source of him fathering a child with one of the maids who worked in the house. Begley's version was much simpler, though, than Mr. C's. Tom Keogh uttered, "Carry on, lads," and McMahon was shot dead, and that was all that Begley had to say. A 9 or 10-year-old boy opened the door at 117 Morehampton Road. His father, Thomas Smith, owned the house, but his wife stated at the military inquiry how that morning went as follows. "I saw some men coming up the stairs," she said, "who appeared to number about 20 with revolvers in their hands. They then told me to put my hands up, and my husband came out on the landing and asked for a little time to put on his clothes, which they granted. I then asked if I could go into my baby in the next room, and they pushed me roughly into it. I then heard about 8 shots. A minute or two later, I heard John Caldow, who was staying with us, call out Kate, meaning his sister, run for the doctor. I then came out and saw John Caldow in the entrance to the room lying on his back wounded. I passed him and saw my husband lying very badly wounded and Mr. McLean dead. My husband had no regular occupation and owned property. His age was 47. He did not take part in politics, but was very friendly with Captain McLean, who had just resigned from the army. Caldow, as she mentioned, survives, but Smith, her husband, died later from the wounds to his chin, chest, buttock and hip. These men were shot in a spare room at the front of the house when McLean had begged not to be killed in front of his wife. The maid from 28 Hours for Terrace answered a ring at the door. A man asked for Mr. Fitzpatrick, and she replied there was no Fitzpatrick living here, just a Captain John Fitzgerald, and would the 2 men like to see him instead? 4 more men joined them from the pavement and entered the house, 3 going up to Fitzgerald's room. She testified herself, "I next heard Captain Fitzgerald scream and 3 shots in quick succession. The party then left the house and walked away quietly." Fitzgerald was shot through the forehead, in the right wrist, where he tried obviously to shield himself, in the chest and in the neck. He was 22 years old, and someone had already tried to kill him in County Clare. In his bedroom in the Gresham Hotel, Captain McCormack was having breakfast in bed and, as I said, reading the Irish Field. He was shot through the head, in the neck, in the wrist and in the groin. The racing paper, as we know, was still in his hands. The blankets were singed from the closeness of the firing. On the next floor, Mr. Leonard Wilde was found lying face down on the floor of his room. The medical examiner noted as follows. He said that he was lying in a pool of blood and there was part of his brain lying in front of his head. There was another bullet in the back of his right leg. His only other testimony was that the dead man seemed well nourished and appeared to be about 35. The London Times consider Wilde an innocent abroad. Wilde is the one we know, as I said, least about still. And the London Times even published one of Wilde's letters to Arthur Henderson, who was then Secretary of the Labour Party, asking how, as he put it in the letter, this simple Roman Catholic could best consecrate his life to Labour's magnificent fight for real democracy in Ireland. Others have said he was an adventurer. Others still have even said he was a relative of Oscar Wilde, amongst all sorts of other quite adventurous things. Archbishop Clune even told the manager of the Gresham Hotel that he was nothing but a British spy who had been thrown out of Spain. The men who shot him, in a way, were just told to go there and kill him and go. In Fitzwilliam Square, Captain Crawford's wife appealed to the men who seemed intent on shooting her husband. She convinced them that he was not the Major O'Callaghan they wanted. Before they left, one man warned, "You bloody well clear out of this country in 20 hours or we will do for you tomorrow night." Joe McGuinness was among the men who entered the Eastwood Hotel in Leeson Street, only to find the 2 men they wanted had already gone. Sean Smith's appointment with 4 officers at the Standard Hotel in Harcourt Street was called off and never kept. There was no longer anyone there to kill. Patrick Lawson was told to go to some house in Phibsborough, as he put it, but when Sunday came, another order arrived telling him not to go. In the Shelburne Hotel, one man shot his own reflection in a mirror on the staircase. The British officer overhead heard the commotion and fled. A Mr. Clevedon, who boarded in a house near St. Stephen's Green, was lucky enough not to have returned home the night before. When a porter in a hotel in Exchequer Street would not give the room numbers to match the wanted names in the hotel register, the IRA thought about shooting every man in the place, it was said. But nothing took place. And there were other attempts, unmentioned and unconfirmed, that morning. Todd Andrews found a woman in Captain Noble's bed in a flat in Ranelagh, half naked and alone. He could not decide whether he felt, as he said, glad or sorry that Noble had not been there. In this, he was possibly not alone. By 9:30 that morning, there were many perhaps wondering if they were glad or sorry about their part in this morning's work. Charles Dalton wrote in his memoir that when it was over, he said, I started to run. I could no longer control my overpowering need to run, to fly, to leave behind me those threatening streets. Later, he wrote, I thought over our morning's work and offered up a prayer for the fallen. Matty MacDonald told Ernie O'Malley, as he put it, that Charlie Dalton was very nervous. We went to the Capitol Theatre that night to ease his mind. I got the wind up rightly, was all Dalton would admit himself when Ernie O'Malley asked. Yet for one who in some ways had had a lot of experience as an intelligence officer, who'd been involved in a number of different events up to this point, for one who was so afraid himself or so troubled by what he'd seen himself that day, Dalton made little allowance for those who'd never been asked to kill or see killing like this before. He complained, as he put it, that in some instances the excuses put forward for the non-carrying out of instructions were not considered very satisfactory, in particular those received from the Commandant of the 1st Battalion regarding 2 addresses they should have visited on the North Circular Road. Todd Andrews knew all about this kind of suspicion. He wrote, I felt that short of actual death, I would be unable to persuade my comrades in the company or in the battalion that I had not faked an accident to avoid the mission. This, of course, was nonsense, but I felt that I could not live with myself if I failed for any reason to turn up. Some men in K Company of the 3rd Battalion quickly began, apparently, to regret that they had. Larry Nugent found it difficult to get any information from them about what had happened on Bloody Sunday morning. The men, he said, would not talk. 3 men of K Company never returned to duty after the operation. Twice in his bureau statement, Nugent said that the men, as he put it, did not like this operation, but orders were orders and had to be obeyed. It was outside the ordinary scope of the soldier, as another put it, and some reacted to the pressure better than others, was how Frank Thornton summed it up. Unsteady nerves and shaking beginners' hands may be explained why so many of the wounded survived. Even the dead were sometimes shot in unusual places, in parts of the body where a wound would never kill. The shootings were by nature often hurried and frenetic. The likelihood of failure was high. But in Upper Mount Street, one man apparently had to have his gun taken away because his hand shook too much to fire. Others, of course, seemed to be slightly exhilarated about the thought of this morning and what was going to happen, and were overheard discussing it as they rushed even from the scene. Joe McGuinness was so frustrated that the man he was meant to shoot was not at home that he was said to have thrown his gun into the canal. Some just seemed to admire what others had done. Matty MacDonald, for example, spoke of Jimmy Doyle, who was involved that day. He said, Jimmy Doyle was the coolest man you ever saw. It appears that Jimmy was on guard on a landing. He was a quiet Wicklow man, quiet and always smiling. There was a mirror on the landing and 2 of the British intelligence men came sneaking down when they heard the racket to grab Jimmy, but he didn't seem to be taking any precautions, and just as they came close to them, he shot the 2 of them. Indeed, across a whole different range of sources, there seemed to be a growing admiration for those who could shoot and shoot well. Pat McRae was proud that he had driven a car for one of the killings in Bagot Street, but his wife, under the impression that he'd been fishing, apparently put him out of the house when he joked about how plentiful the morning's catch had been. He spent Bloody Sunday night, he said, in St. Anne's Park, but he still couldn't seem to fathom all those years later when he recounted his wife's reaction, why she was so perturbed. He was bemused by why she was so outraged on his behalf. Todd Andrews was certainly outraged with the behaviour of some of his comrades that day. He wrote, there were only women and children in the rest of the house, but that did not prevent the pair from the squad behaving like black and tans. Joe Dolan apparently started a fire, whether by intention or accident, which took the rest of the men about a half an hour to put out. What Andrews failed to mention in his book was that Joe Dolan was suspected of beating one of the women who was in Captain Noble's bed and was accused of stealing her rings, but this was something Dalton only said about it in private to Ernie O'Malley decades after the event. Naturally, Dolan remained silent about it in his bureau statement too. But then Joe Dolan was said to have shot the porter of the Wicklow Hotel one morning and went back in the afternoon to eat his lunch. Again, how much we trust some of these anecdotes is quite troubling. But many of these men had been expected to learn quickly and to put up with what was asked of them. The training was brutal and short, as Vinnie Byrne from the squad explained as follows. He said, first of all, the men selected for squad work were brought on a few jobs and shown how they were carried out. Secondly, each man had to prove his mettle and was detailed to do an actual job himself. Each member of the squad then killed in what Joe Leonard called strict rotation. They quickly became, in some cases, proud of being known as an elite, as paid, young, full-time, if you like, gunmen. They enjoyed being feared in London as gangs of tough youngsters, as wild young men, as some of the material coming out of London was saying at the time. Obsessive to the point of, in some cases, almost fetishistic about revolvers. They had favourite weapons and squabbles, if you like, in between the different events they were involved in, about who was the best shot, about which was better, the Webley, the Mauser or the Colt. They were staunch supporters of a variety of different guns and whether or not which one was easier to conceal under your clothes. Charles Dalton himself from the intelligence department had a holster made for himself, a holster made out of a mail sack, but a holster nonetheless. Tom Kyoat was said, never moved without his gun, as Harry Colley put it. He was dead by the age of 23. They all carried 45s, not 38s, because it had taken Detective Inspector Smith, the first detective to be killed in July 1919, 2 weeks to die from his wounds from a 38. So a 45 would be the weapon of choice after that. And again, they talk at length about, this type of thing. Some talking about they always brought a revolver as well as an automatic, the revolver in case the automatic stuck, like they had learned that it did from reading about how the Germans used it during the war. Many of them, as we've seen, were still teenagers when they were asked to join, possibly, as some said, with consciences more likely to overlook things older men might not condone. Mick White is supposed to have eaten one of the dead men's breakfasts on Bloody Sunday morning. I mean, indeed, Vinnie Byrne recorded how he enjoyed, as he said, plugging British soldiers, but he still filled his pockets with licorice, like any child would when he took part in a raid of the B&I stores. Byrne, as I said, was 19 when he went to that house in Upper Mount Street on Bloody Sunday morning, and it was noted with astonishment by Ned Bry, as he put it, how quickly and with what devotion these young men got down to their jobs. Anything they lacked in age and experience, they made up in enthusiasm. These men may have had a conscience, but as one commentator at the time in Blackwood's magazine in London had put it, they had certainly come to terms with it. Byrne may have had qualms about being put in charge of older, more experienced men like Tom Ennis on Bloody Sunday morning, but he could only feel pity, as he said, for the old medical officer, as he called him, sent with us, who did not know what to do with a gun. He said, we were all young, 20, 21. We never thought we'd win or lose. We just wanted to have a go. We'd go out in pairs, walk up to the target and do it, then split. You wouldn't be nervous while you'd be waiting to plug him, but you'd imagine everyone was looking into your face. It was up to you to see that it was done, however you went about it. For Joe Dolan, it was a simple matter. He said, we had to learn to kill in cold blood and we got used to it. It is difficult to read some of the statements from men like Byrne, Dolan, Leonard without concluding that these men took some degree of satisfaction from this thing that they had become quite good at. Byrne said, it was the joy of my life when I was handed a 45 revolver and 6 rounds. But the killing took its toll on some of them. Liam Tobin was said to have had a nervous breakdown before Bloody Sunday could be carried out as he planned. He had become, according to David Nelligan, gaunt, cynical, as he put it, with tragic eyes. He looked like a man who had seen the inside of hell. Bernard Burns spoke of the agony of the drivers who had time to think in their cars of what was being done as they waited outside. He mentioned 3 of them, he said, who became nerve cases as a result of their work. But in most of these examples and others like them, these things are said of others, never said by the man about himself. Dalton spoke of Tobin's nerves, Colley told of Dalton's drinking. Thornton admitted that Mick MacDonald's health collapsed and he was sent by Collins to California. You only told someone else's secrets, not your own. But with the recently released military service pension applications, this is now no longer the case. Albert Rutherford, who'd taken part in the killings at Upper Pembroke Street, reflected on what Bloody Sunday morning, as he saw it, had meant. He said, as that certain job alone has been a great strain on men's nerves, there were only 14 or 15 inside, and a job of that disagreeable nature was something more than active service and should entitle those 14 to at least the entire period. In other words, Rutherford thought that Bloody Sunday morning alone was worth the equivalent of a full IRA service pension for the entire period of the War of Independence and Civil War, that he deserved and those others deserved a pension at the highest rates just for that morning alone. 2 of the 7 men noted as going into the house in Morehampton Road in later life spent time in Grangegorman Hospital. John Odonnell, described by one of his pension referees, as he said, as having cracked up as a consequence of Bloody Sunday, or as another put it, his nerves went astray after that one day, was first treated for neurasthenia, as they called it at the time, at St Vincent's Hospital in January 1921. His was a short revolution. He got a pension for just 1 5/8 years, and the officer in command of his old company made it clear in his reference for that application that Bloody Sunday was to blame for his truncated service. That officer, Henry O'Farrell, wrote of him as follows. He said, O'Donnell was door guard at Morehampton Road on Bloody Sunday. An incident occurred with one of the children in the house, which later played so much on his mind as to cause the trouble from which he suffered. His condition became very noticeable, frequently referring to this incident. Later, he became very sullen and silent, in fact, an all-round peculiarity in his manner, which compels me to withdraw the work I had up to this entrusted to him. The incident referred to, O'Farrell finished, was that of the child who begged of him not to shoot Daddy. From the inquest, we know that that 10-year-old boy had let O'Donnell and the others into the house. O'Donnell was 31 when he went to Morehampton Road. When he was 42, he was admitted to Grangegorman Hospital, where he was treated for just over 12 months. From his pension application, we know that he married, that he went back to work, that he had at least 1 child of his own, and that he was dead by the age of 58. In 1937, James Norton, also one of the men in Morehampton Road, submitted an assessment of his own health in his pension application, or his disability pension application, as follows. He described himself throughout in the third person and wrote, as a result of his experiences on active service, culminating in the events of Bloody Sunday, 21st November 1920, in which applicant was personally responsible as one of the firing party for the shooting of 3 British intelligence officers, 2 of which were killed and 1 seriously wounded, in the presence of their screaming wives and children. The applicant's mental condition showed gradual deterioration during the months following, until complete mental breakdown was reached in July 21, when applicants single-handed and without orders got on the middle of the roadway at the Custom House and, armed with a revolver, attempted to capture a tender of British troops. 2 years later, he sent on some more information about himself, and he said, I've been in and out of Grangegorman Hospital very often since, that I was advised to go to England for a complete change, where he actually suffered what he termed a complete breakdown there, spending several months in 2 hospitals. He finished his statement as follows to the pension board. I was 20 years of age in November 1920, and he left it at that. Henry O'Farrell, his officer in command, called him, as he said, one of my special men. The phrase in and out of Grangegorman Hospital that he'd used did poor justice to his own pension claim. Grangegorman confirmed that he was there for a month in 1922, from January to April 1923, again from August 1923 to January 1924, all of May 1924, all of September and most of October of the same year, and from February to October of 1925. And it seems this pattern continues through the 1930s as well. Back from Britain, he was hospitalised again in 1939, in 1940, and across most of 1941, 1945 and 1946. Made a ward of court in 1954, he spent the rest of his life in the hospital, where he died in his 70s in December 1974. Grangegorman described his condition as follows, as manic depressive psychosis, and while the hospital noted his problems with drink, they said, was described as only a sequel to his unstable mental condition and not a cause. A police report from May 1939 on his pension file gives us another glimpse. It described his family home in Phibsborough, a father, a carpenter, a sister, a shop assistant, the mother, as the policeman wrote, who keeps house. Sergeant Scully, who wrote this, was diligent in his task, and he asked about the street and found that they were, as he put it, looked upon locally as a struggling working class family. He also found that Norton had one friend, a constant companion he called him, who let Norton use his address for correspondence about his pension application, because, as Scully writes, Norton was anxious that his parents or friends should not learn that his mental condition is so serious as to have him granted a pension. And in a way, on top of all the rest of it, it seems that he tried to hide what effectively couldn't be hid. But what are we to do with all of this type of information? And in ways I'm not sure I know. We can trace a straight and stark line from Morehampton Road to Grangegorman Hospital, but I have neither the expertise nor the right to do that. While a cynic might say that it was in every applicant's interest to pin their wounds to the pension board and all their hurts and madnesses on their active service alone, that with money, a pension for life at stake, of course, their war would be the cause of all their woes. But I would hope I'm not so jaded as to settle just for that. At the same time, there is the temptation to be too simplistic in what we might infer from these 2 of 7 men who went into that one house on Bloody Sunday. They get to speak, if you like, for no one but themselves. We cannot rush to diagnose some form of post-traumatic stress disorder in every veteran of the Irish Revolution as a result. The wards of Grange Gorman and elsewhere ached with plenty of other sufferings and hurts, while the pension applications, if they show us anything, show us decades of routine and struggle and ordinariness, lives lived maybe with all sorts of traumas buried and well hidden, but maybe also with no trauma there at all. But where these applications differ, as I said, from other sources I've found so far, is in the certainty of this type of evidence. We now get the doctor's pronouncements, the applicants themselves stating so explicitly what they suffered from and why. Up to this, it's been a mixture of little better than guessing, gossip and hearsay. Like Odonnell and Norton, Charles Dalton's application details the distress we only up to this knew anecdotes and rumours about. Doctors write of what they termed his delusions and hallucinations, how they all referred back to those earlier years, that voices in his head accuse him of murder, as one said, and urge his destruction. That, as another put it, his whole delusional state is definitely linked up with his previous military experience, that his own active service has preyed upon his mind and conscience, so that in the following years he has gradually lost his reason. One old comrade, Frank Soren, reminded the assessors of the pension that Dalton, as he said, was a mere schoolboy when he commenced, as Soren put it, his career as a gunman, and went on to explain what he termed a pitiable incident, with Dalton cowering, as he said, from imaginary potential executioners in his home, that while being treated in a nursing home, that Dalton made Soren stay, made him stand outside, as he said, armed and in his view, and he had to be shown the guns for the purpose of dealing with the same imaginary enemies. His pension file also notes some of the time spent in different hospitals, the worry of his wife with 4 young children, who wrote in for assistance in 1940 for the cost of the medical treatment she could not afford. It was a letter she could never have imagined writing when she married him just over 10 years before. But Dalton's file has been noteworthy up to now for most who consult it because of a 5-page handwritten letter Sean Lemass submitted in support of Dalton's case. As Minister for Supplies in wartime Ireland, the time and care he gave his words in 1941 in support of the application of what was, after all, an old Civil War enemy may well be significant in their own right. But any significance we set by this capacity to see past Civil War divides perhaps says more of our rather simple understanding of those people and how they coped with Civil War. We maybe shouldn't be so shocked at Lemass's facility for fellow feeling with Dalton's wife and her family's plight. Civil War divisions were more ambivalent and ambiguous than our rigid and limited assumptions about them have ever allowed. Indeed, Lemass's long letter is perhaps more striking for the direct link he made between Dalton's condition and Bloody Sunday morning. I could just give you a quick example of it. He wrote, "I first became seriously concerned about him, however, on the evening of Sunday, November 21st, 1920, since called Bloody Sunday. On the morning of that day, a number of British government agents in Dublin were shot. It was your husband's duty to accompany a party of IRA to one house occupied by 4 of these agents, all of whom were shot. He returned subsequently to the billet at St. William Street, and I realised that he had become unnerved by his experiences of the morning. So obvious was his condition that I and one of the others took him out for a walk, although it was an undesirable and risky thing to do and might have drawn attention to the billet. It did not improve his condition, and during that night he was on occasions inclined to be hysterical. I recollect that a tap in the dispensary was leaking and making a gurgling noise. This noise apparently reminded your husband of a similar noise he had heard when the 4 men were shot. He shouted to us several times to stop the noise of the tap, and it was with difficulty that he was quietened. At this period, your husband was very young, and his experiences could not but have left a permanent mark on him." While Lemass clearly adjudged that such detail was the way to do best by this woman he wrote to and her husband's application to the pension board, others corroborate his description of that night. And again, you see Mattie MacDonald say the same thing to Ernie O'Malley about Dalton's distress and using the same kind of phrases. Indeed, Dalton used the same words himself, as we've seen, when he recounted the day to O'Malley. And that phrase, those phrases about gurgling keeps coming up again and again. Among other things, Dalton is a fascinating example of the nature of telling about this day, of what he could and couldn't say, of how versions evolve, of the compunction to tell over and over again. And he certainly had plenty of chances to tell. Dalton, for example, spoke to Ernie O'Malley. He gave a bureau statement. He made his pension applications, and as we've seen, he wrote a memoir with the Dublin Brigade, published in 1929, as well as writing other pieces for the newspapers at different times. While his memoir acknowledged the overwhelming impulses we've seen to run, to flee those threatening streets, as he said, his public Bloody Sundays were very different to his private ones, that for all he did not want to tell, there was more others did not want to really hear. Which raises the question, do we want to hear this type of thing now? And what do we do with it? What was intended to be private has been made public in these pension applications, and what was intended to be private, while it will change the possible histories of the Irish Revolution we might write, might well change our conception of what that revolution amounted to. The toll it took far beyond the lives taken and the lives lost. What do we do with those broken by the revolution or affected by it in some of the ways that some of these men describe, and broken in ways that we still might find difficult to admit? Because if they exist, maybe the boy's own adventure version becomes hard, if not impossible, to write and accept. While we may have come long and far from the Dublin's fighting story type accounts of any period of the Irish Revolution, the extent to which actions such as Bloody Sunday are still, particularly the morning, are still written of in terms of the daring do of the cunning intelligence coup is striking still. Daring do is all very well, but these applications mean we cannot maybe overlook what it asked. One of Dalton's referees described him in his application as follows: as one of the few famous intelligence officers attached to GHQ. For him, Dalton had earned an exemplary reputation for himself in these years, but his pension applications can only leave us wondering at what cost. But if we look at even just these three examples another way, do we end up, for want of a kinder way of putting it, with a history of hard cases and little more? Norton, Odonnell, Dalton, they all signed up to fight. They were probably quite willing parties to a certain type of war. In Dalton's case, this is most pressing of all, because in his pension files there is little beyond one very terse reference to his prominence in the army mutiny, or to the type of civil war that he chose to fight, the type of mutinous stance he struck afterwards, when he and many others were told they just weren't needed anymore. In his files, he comes out as a sympathetic figure, but so too are the parents of Edwin Hughes, described as both broken down completely physically and mentally, the civil servant who could no longer work, the music teacher who could no longer teach, because their teenage son may well have been killed along with two other youngsters of the age of 16 and 17, possibly by Charles Dalton in October 1922. In 1933, the board was requested not to even address correspondence about the application to Edwin Hughes's parents, because it was felt by his brother that any mention of Edwin's name would serve no good purpose to his family. That over a decade after, they still could not bear to describe or discuss the circumstances of their son's death. In a way, these records and the fact that we're finding more and more material of this kind leaves us in a really very interesting position, and in a position that makes it much harder to write any very straightforward history of the Irish Revolution from these accounts. In many ways, Bloody Sunday morning, as we've seen from these records, casts a long and complex shadow, and our history of that morning, never mind that day, is very far from run.